What's up, students? Welcome to US History, and today we're talking about the Civil War. Now, Abraham Lincoln takes office on March 4th, 1861, and he literally has to sneak into the Capitol. Why, you might ask? Because Washington, D.C. is in between the slave state of Maryland and the slave state of Virginia. That's right, the capital of the North was in the South. Now, by the time Lincoln gets into office, 7 states have already seceded. Now, secession caused a lot of controversy. There were questions about the national debt and how the South would help pay that off because, you know, they kind of helped create it. There were questions about the territories out west and how they would be split up. The South still wanted their fugitive slaves back, but if they're a separate nation, then the North isn't required to do that. And also, Europe. Now, in the case of a civil war, Europe was gonna play a big part. Did they need southern cotton? Yes. But did they need northern grains? Yes. Now, Lincoln promised that there would be no conflict unless the South provoked it. Now, before we really get into this, there's 2 key terms you need to know. The first key term is antebellum, and all this basically means is pre-Civil War. And the second term is fire eaters. Now, these were just Southerners who blamed all of their problems on the North. So when these states seceded, they took control of national forts, mints, and public property. But there were 2 forts that they did not get control of. And those were Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter basically controlled the entire Bay of Charleston. And there were about 100 men there, but they were running out of supplies. And if they ran out of supplies, they would have to surrender the fort to the seceded states. Lincoln was not about that, but he knew if he sent reinforcements to the fort, South Carolina would fight back. So he reaches out to the governor of South Carolina and says, hey, we're gonna send a ship down, but there will only be supplies. No reinforcements. Is that chill? And the governor said, if you send that ship, we finna fight. Things were getting juicy. But Lincoln, wanting to protect federal property, sent the ship anyways. And true to his word, it only had supplies, no reinforcements. But South Carolina didn't care. And on August 12th, 1861, South Carolina fired on the fort. They fought for 34 hours. And no one died. These are some of the worst marksmen in the world. 34, you would think that at least one would hit. Well, actually, there was one death. A horse. So anyways, Fort Sumter is forced to surrender. And the Civil War has begun. Now, a man from the South named Edmund Ruffin took responsibility for shooting that first shot and starting the Civil War. You do you, brother. So after the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteer troops for a span of 90 days. He was only off by 4 years and 2 million troops, but that's no biggie. But more than 75,000 troops showed up, so he turned them away. Now, the South also called for volunteers, but they didn't set a limit. They said, if you show up, you're in the army. So now, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina have all seceded, and the capital of the South was moved to Richmond, Virginia, only 90 miles from Washington, D.C. Now, the border states between the North and the South became critical in this Civil War. More than half of the South's white population lived in the border states. More than half of the manufacturing industry was there, and almost all the railroads ran through the border states. So when the Civil War broke out, Lincoln realized that he was trapped between a slave state and a slave state. And if Maryland seceded, he would be cut off from the North. So he declared martial law in Maryland. Now, this basically means that the military is sent in and takes over total control of the entire state. So even if Maryland wanted to secede, they couldn't. But to keep all these border states happy, Lincoln said he would not stop slavery in any of the border states. And this was kind of helpful because anti-slavery was not very popular in the Midwest. Now, Lincoln wanted to keep the entire Union together. And when he said save the Union at all costs, he meant that he was okay with slavery staying, but not spreading. Now, there were tons of people in both the North and the South that did a little switchamagoo. As in, they were living in the South, but really supported the North, so they went up north. And vice versa. Now, there were about 58,000 mountain whites who technically lived in the South, but did not support slavery. So they went up north. Now, about 300,000 total people switched sides to fight for the North instead of the South, and vice versa. Families were split. And that's the real tragedy of the Civil War. It was brother against brother. Now, let's break down this matchup of North v. South. Let's start with the South. The South was fighting on their home turf because the Union would have to come and attack them. They were fighting for their way of life. slavery. And they had by far more talented military officers. By far. They had better horsemen and marksmen because a lot of people in the South still went out and killed their own dinner. They didn't really have that many city people. And here's a key one. They only had to tie the Union because in a tie, they would still be their own nation. They didn't have to beat the North. They just had to tire them out until they would let them stay a confederacy. Now, the South had a lot of weaknesses too. They had fewer factories. The length of the total war would really become a disadvantage. They had poor transportation. They didn't have a navy, so they had to build one. They didn't have a functioning or respected government. And they didn't really get any foreign aid, even though they expected it. And now for the North. The North's economy was really strong. They held 75% of the nation's wealth before the war. They had established trade relations. They had a lot of railroads. They had a navy. They had immigrants coming in constantly. They had a functioning and respected government and a much bigger population. In fact, let's break that down for a second. The North had 22 million total people. If you take out the women and the men who aren't of fighting age, they had about 5.5 million troops. Now the South only had 16.5 million people. If you take out women and men that aren't of fighting age, plus the slaves, they were down to about 2,750,000 able troops. But some of those troops had to stay behind and run the farms or control the slaves. And the North also had immigrants constantly coming in. So the North ultimately had the upper hand. But the North had its weaknesses. Their commanders were awful. They went through 7 different generals before they won a major battle. 7. They also were not prepared, and they didn't have a common cause for fighting. Some people were there because they thought the South was acting illegally. Some were fighting as abolitionists to free the slaves, and some were fighting for just the money you earn for your service. Now, how hard do you think you're gonna fight if you're only in it for the money? Well, here's something to think about. You don't get to use the money if you're dead. Yeah, those guys pretty much just fired a few shots and ran away. Let's talk about King Cotton for a second. Now, the South really wanted European intervention in the Civil War, but the European working class liked the North because of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They wanted to end slavery. But British textile mills really needed Southern cotton. But luckily for the North, in 1858, 59, and 60, the South had abundant harvests. And to save money, the South sold as much of it as they possibly could. So by the time the Civil War broke out, England had a 3-year surplus of cotton. And also, Egypt started to grow cotton. And Egypt's cotton was cheaper, closer, better, and not being blockaded by the North. And as the North fought back the South, they seized cotton and sold it to England and France. But England and France also needed northern wheat and corn. And really, the North beat the South at their own game. Farming. So anyways, England sold supplies to both the North and the South. But England had an alliance with the North that they wouldn't help out the South. But they did it anyways and built ships for the South. So how did England get around this treaty? Well, they would build the ships, but didn't arm any of them. They would just leave little holes and brackets for the cannons, but just wouldn't put the cannons on. And England thought they were so sneaky, but the North knew they were doing it. Part of the reason is because of the Trent Affair of 1861. Now, a Union ship north of Cuba stopped a British ship called Trent. It removed 2 Southern diplomats that were heading for England. And that kind of pissed off England. So they sent troops to Canada. That's right, the North almost got into a war with England while still fighting the South. But luckily that didn't happen. Now, England was the chief naval base for the South, and some Southern ships had former British commanders running them, and the North had to weaken their blockade of the South to go chase down these Southern ships, such as the Alabama, which sunk a ton of Union ships and then was chased all the way to Europe and finally sunk. Now, these British-built ships captured more than 250 Union ships, and in 1863, the layered ram was invented for the South. Now, these boats had giant iron rams at the front of them and huge guns, and their purpose was to destroy the Union blockade. And the US minister to England, who was the son of John Quincy Adams, told England that if they kept building these ships for the South, it would mean war. Now, England was like, they're kind of preoccupied with the South. I think we can beat them. But then they remembered the other 2 times they tried to fight America and were like, okay, all right, we'll back down. And after the war, England felt really bad for helping the South. So they compensated the US with $15.2 million for damages. And this was called an indemnity, which basically meant, sorry for sinking all your ships, please don't kill us. Now, the South also used Canada to attack. but didn't really do much. Now, France saw everything that was going on in America, and they were like, this is the perfect opportunity to get Mexico. Why? So Napoleon III sent an army to Mexico in 1863 and made his cousin, the Archduke Maximilian of Austria, the emperor. Now the Mexicans were like, hold on a second. So first the French invade, they don't speak Spanish, and then they put this Austrian guy who doesn't speak Spanish or French in charge. What? France knew that by doing this, they were violating the Monroe Doctrine. But since the North was kind of preoccupied and they thought the South was gonna win, they were like, what are they gonna do about it? So anyways, as time goes on, France sees that the North is winning and is like, oh shoot, and pulled out their army. But Napoleon III left Maximilian there, all alone. And so on the 5th of May, the Mexicans capture Maximilian and retake their country. And in celebration, they drawed and quartered Maximilian. And in case you don't know what that is, they basically take 4 horses, tie all of his arms and legs to a different horse, and say, yeah! And Maximilian was literally pulled apart. So now, let's talk about the North versus the South and their leaders. So the Southern Constitution was taken from the original, but allowed states to secede. They're still trying to justify their own secession. But in 1864, Georgia wanted to secede from the South. Now with the Cherokee Nation, which is technically its own country, inside of Georgia, this would mean that there would be a country in a country in a country in a country. I can't believe Georgia wanted to secede from the seceded states. So, Jefferson Davis, the president of the South, really didn't get along with his Congress. He was kind of unwilling to bend and was like, hey guys, my way or the highway. But the presidency in the Confederate States of America was really weak. So often, it was the highway. Lincoln, on the other hand, didn't have that many problems, in part because he had an established and stable government. And he also worked better with the public and their opinions. Now, Lincoln did some things that were definitely illegal according to the Constitution. And really, he should have been impeached. But all-out war kind of gives Lincoln executive privilege. And Congress approved all the stuff that he did once they met. And that's why he wasn't impeached. Congress supported him. Now, one of the things Lincoln did was suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Now, in case you don't remember, habeas corpus just means that you have to tell somebody why they're being arrested before you can actually arrest them. Now, it was technically legal to suspend habeas corpus in a time of war according to the Constitution, but you need congressional approval, and Lincoln didn't get that because Congress wasn't in session. So basically, Lincoln put a bunch of people in jail who he thought were dangers to the Union. Let's talk about the common soldier. So in the North, there were plenty of volunteers until 1863. But the reason there weren't that many volunteers after 1863 was because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, a lot of soldiers felt that it was a slavery issue and that they were fighting for the slaves, which they didn't really like. And desertions in the army skyrocketed that year. Come on, people, you're better than that. So anyways, in 1863, the first ever conscription law in the history of the United States was passed. Now, the conscription law was just a draft. Basically, the government would say, hey, you have to be in the army now. And people were pissed. And riots broke out in New York over this draft. But people could pay their way out of being drafted. People who were being drafted were allowed to pay someone $300 to take their place. Now, some people saw this as a business opportunity, and they were called bounty jumpers. So these guys would stand outside of a recruiting office, offer their services to someone, get the $300, go into the recruiting office, sneak out the back, and go down the street to the next recruiting office and do the whole thing again. One guy did this 32 times before he was caught. And he had to go to war. Now, luckily for the North, this conscription law wasn't crazy important because 90% of the troops for the North were volunteers. Now, the South also had mostly volunteers, but they didn't have the population to back it up. So they started their own conscription law in 1862, and they took men from ages 17 to 50. And as the war went on, they got more and more desperate. In fact, in the final battle, there were men from ages 10 to 82 fighting. Now, Southerners could also buy their way out, but also If a Southerner had more than 20 slaves, they did not have to go. But most Southerners who had more than 20 slaves were military officers and had high-ranking positions in the Confederate Army. So, as most wars, the Civil War was a poor man's fight, but a rich man's war. Speaking of money, let's talk about how both sides financed their war effort. The North increased their tax on both alcohol and tobacco. They established their first income tax. A new tariff increased 5 to 10% based on the product. The US Treasury printed green paper money, but there was no gold to back it up, so it caused inflation. And by the end of the war, it was about 39 cents to the dollar. The North also sold war bonds, $2.6 billion worth of war bonds. That's not today's 2.6 billion, that's 1860's 2.6 billion. That's a lot of money. And there was a new national banking system that standardized currency. Now the South also sold war bonds. $400 million worth. That's only a $2.2 billion difference between the North and the South. No biggie. But the key thing here is, all of those Southern investors lost that money. Now the South also put a 10% tax on all farm produce. They also started to print blue paper dollar bills, which in the South caused extreme inflation. Breakfast in Richmond in 1864 cost $141. That ain't no McDonald's dollar menu. The inflation was so bad that in the South, it was 1.6 cents to the dollar. So it was literally cheaper to burn money than to buy firewood. They would wrap it really tight, throw it in the furnace, and burn it. It was a 9,000% inflation rate. Now, during the war, tons of new factories opened in the North, and the United States gets its first class of millionaires. And they were pretty freaking proud of that. But you may be asking, how did they become millionaires? Well, they would sell old horses, shoes with cardboard soles, and moth-eaten wool uniforms to the government. America. Now, during the war, sizes on clothes were finally standardized for men. I don't know what the frick you women are still doing. And farm machines in the North allowed more men to go and fight. But there were a lot of people who moved out west during the war under the Homestead Act of 1862. But not as many as you would think. I mean, if you're given the opportunity to either fight or move out west, you would think more people would move out west. But they didn't. America. Now the war opened up a ton of opportunities for women. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell helped out with the US Sanitary Commission. She revolutionized sanitation on the battlefield, and she organized a way to get medical supplies to the front lines way faster. And also, Clara Barton helped establish the American Red Cross. Now by the end of the war, the South was beat up financially. By 1870, the South had only 12% of the nation's wealth, and the average per capita income for a Southerner before the war was 2/3 of a Northerner's, and after the war, it was 2/5 of a Northerner's. And by this time, Northern manufacturers dominated the economy, and Western grain growers beat the South at the growing game. So yeah, the South was beat up. Now I know what you're thinking. Wait a second, it's the Civil War. Where's all the battles? Well, that's a story for another time. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoy. You can subscribe right here so you never miss a video. And you can check out our other channel, FlexTalk Students, where we do videos on emotions, relationships, and character. Flex out.